For decades, the Corvette didn't just represent speed, it represented certainty. It was loud when the world was quiet, big when others went small. A rolling declaration that American engineering didn't need permission or refinement to win. The Corvette wasn't built to ask questions, it was built to dominate. And for a long time, that was enough. But by the late 1980s, something uncomfortable was happening. On paper, the Corvette still looked untouchable. V8 power, aggressive styling, a legacy no foreign badge could match. Yet quietly, almost invisibly, the rules of performance were changing. Not in drag races, not in advertising slogans, but in places most people weren't watching. Test tracks, quality audits, long-term reliability charts, and the hands of drivers who expected more than straight-line speed. Across the Pacific, Japanese engineers weren't chasing the Corvette's image. They weren't trying to out-muscle it or out-shout it. Instead, they were asking different questions. Why did some cars feel faster even when they weren't? Why did precision matter more than raw numbers? Why did consistency beat spectacle? And slowly, the answers began to expose a problem. The Corvette hadn't become bad, it had become vulnerable. Handling gaps appeared. Build inconsistencies were harder to ignore. The idea that horsepower alone could carry a reputation started to crack. Not publicly, not dramatically, but enough that engineers inside General Motors noticed something was wrong, even if the audience hadn't yet. The most dangerous moment for any icon isn't failure, it's irrelevance. And as the world moved toward refinement, balance, and repeatable excellence, America's sports car faced a reality it had never prepared for. Survival would require change. Not louder engines, not bigger claims, but learning, quietly, from the very engineers it once dismissed. After World War II, Japan rebuilt its auto industry in the shadow of American dominance. Early Japanese cars were dismissed as cheap, underpowered copies, temporary solutions from a nation still catching up. Detroit barely noticed them, and when it did, it wasn't with concern. Horsepower, chrome, and cubic inches still ruled the definition of greatness. But something different was happening beneath the surface. Japanese engineers weren't trying to beat America at its own game. They were studying why American cars succeeded and where they quietly failed. Instead of chasing peak output, they obsessed over how machines behaved every single time they were driven. Tolerances tightened. Processes were documented. Failures were treated as data, not embarrassment. This mindset changed everything. Reliability stopped being a bonus and became the baseline. Consistency mattered more than headline numbers. A car wasn't impressive because it could do something once under perfect conditions. It was impressive because it could do it again, and again, and again. In contrast, American performance culture celebrated excess. Bigger engines solved problems quickly, even if they created new ones elsewhere. If something flexed, reinforce it. If it overheated, add power and call it character. The system as a whole mattered less than the result in isolation. Japan rejected that logic. Performance to them was holistic. Engine, chassis, suspension, driver feedback. Everything was interconnected. A flaw anywhere weakened the whole. And by the late 1980s, this philosophy was no longer theoretical. It was winning races, earning trust, and reshaping expectations. The Corvette still sat proudly at the top of America's sports car hierarchy. But the ground beneath it was shifting. Japan wasn't attacking muscle cars head-on. It was quietly redefining what better actually meant. And most of the industry didn't realize the rules had changed. By the time anyone looked up, the scoreboard had shifted, and the old assumptions that once protected American dominance no longer guaranteed respect, loyalty, or long-term leadership on the global stage. The Corvette entered the 1990s carrying a reputation heavy enough to hide its problems. On the surface, everything looked right. The engines were large. The numbers were strong. The badge still commanded respect. But underneath, Contradictions were piling up. Straight-line speed masked handling that struggled to keep up with modern roads. Interior quality lagged behind expectations. Build consistency varied from car to car in ways owners noticed immediately. Competitors exposed these gaps without trying to. Japanese performance cars didn't overpower the Corvette, they outcomposed it. They felt tighter, more predictable, easier to drive at the limit. On real pavement in daily use, the difference wasn't subtle. The Corvette could be thrilling in moments. Its rivals were satisfying all the time. Inside General Motors, engineers saw the warning signs. Track data told one story, customer feedback told another. Fixes existed, but they clashed with tradition. The Corvette had always relied on brute force to overwhelm weaknesses. That approach had built legends, but now it slowed progress. Every improvement sparked resistance. Changing too much risked alienating loyalists who believed the Corvette should feel raw, even if raw meant compromised. This was the quiet crisis. Not a collapse, not a scandal, but a slow realization that reputation was doing more work than reality. The car wasn't failing. It was standing still while expectations moved forward. And that created the most dangerous contradiction of all. The Corvette needed to evolve to survive, but the mindset that created it no longer knew how to change. What followed would quietly reshape the Corvette, but first it had to admit that power alone was no longer the answer, and that truth unsettled everyone involved inside the program. The change did not arrive with press releases or public apologies. It arrived quietly, inside conference rooms, test tracks, and engineering reviews where assumptions were finally questioned. Corvette engineers began looking outward, not for styling cues or marketing tricks, but for methods. Japanese manufacturers had mastered something Detroit rarely discussed: how small decisions compounded into large advantages. Balance was engineered, not tuned afterward. Driver feedback was treated as data, not opinion. Reliability under stress was tested obsessively, not assumed. This learning didn't come from surrender or partnership headlines. It came from benchmarking cars that embarrassed expectations, from tearing down components that refused to fail, from studying how systems work together rather than in isolation. Engineers didn't copy parts, they copied thinking. That shift required humility. The Corvette program had long believed greatness came from standing apart. Now it required listening. The goal wasn't to become Japanese. It was to understand why Japanese cars delivered confidence so effortlessly, lap after lap, mile after mile. Slowly, priorities changed. Chassis tuning mattered as much as horsepower. Repeatability became a benchmark. The car had to communicate clearly, not just aggressively. What felt fast had to also feel controllable. These were not visible changes, and that was the point. From the outside, the Corvette still looked unmistakably American. The engine remained loud. The stance remained bold. But beneath the surface, the architecture of decision-making had been rewritten. Influence didn't wear a badge. It lived in processes, tolerances, and expectations. And once those ideas took hold, the Corvette could never return to what it was before. This moment marked the midpoint of the Corvette story, when tradition stopped dictating answers and curiosity took over, setting the stage for changes that would soon redefine performance, credibility, and global respect inside the program and far beyond it in years ahead. The transformation didn't announce itself with revolution. It arrived disguised as refinement. On the road, the Corvette began to feel different. Not slower, never slower, but calmer, more deliberate. The chassis no longer fought the driver. Suspension tuning stopped feeling like a compromise. Power was still abundant, yet it was finally usable, delivered through a platform that could exploit it instead of merely survive it. Reliability improved in ways that rarely make headlines. Panels aligned more consistently. Components aged predictably. Long drives no longer revealed small irritations that added up to doubt. These were not dramatic fixes. They were systemic ones, the result of decisions made far upstream from the showroom. Crucially, these changes were never framed as a philosophical shift. Marketing spoke of evolution, not reinvention. Each improvement was presented as a natural step forward, a refinement of what already existed. That framing mattered. It allowed the Corvette to change without appearing to concede anything. Yet the contradiction was unavoidable. The car now behaved less like a blunt instrument and more like a cohesive machine. Handling, braking, steering, and power delivery worked together, not in competition. The Corvette had learned how to translate strength into confidence. This is where the quiet influence paid off. Systems thinking replaced isolated fixes. Engineers asked how changes interacted, not just whether they increased numbers. Performance became repeatable, not situational. The car could be pushed hard without punishing its driver or itself. By the time enthusiasts noticed, the Corvette was no longer chasing credibility. It had it. Reviews shifted tone. Comparisons changed language. The conversation moved from excuses to expectations. And, perhaps most telling of all, the Corvette never lost its identity. It remained unmistakably American in character and presence. The engine still thundered. The design still demanded attention. But beneath that familiar surface lived a different philosophy, one that proved dominance could be reclaimed not by doubling down on old instincts, but by letting go of the belief that they were untouchable. In doing so, the Corvette demonstrated that evolution, when guided by discipline and curiosity, could preserve legacy while quietly rewriting the rules of what an American performance car could become in the modern era. Stories like this rarely get told because they complicate mythology. The Corvette has always been marketed as self-made, an American triumph built through stubborn independence, raw ingenuity, and refusal to follow anyone else's lead. That image left no room for quiet influence, collaboration, or borrowed thinking. Admitting learning would weaken the legend, so the story stayed buried. Marketing celebrated outcomes, not origins. Better handling became engineering excellence. Improved reliability became attention to detail. No one asked where those priorities came from, and no one rushed to explain. Silence wasn't deception, it was protection. Brands survive on stories as much as products. The Corvette's story depended on the belief that dominance came from within, not from listening outward. Publicly crediting outside influence risked reframing evolution as dependence, even if the result proved the opposite. That's why this chapter lives between the lines. It exists in engineering decisions, not advertisements, in internal benchmarks, not press events. And because it wasn't dramatic or scandalous, it was easy to ignore, which is exactly why it matters. Understanding how the Corvette survived this moment reveals something uncomfortable about innovation itself. Progress rarely looks heroic while it's happening. It looks quiet, observational, uncredited. By hiding how it changed, the Corvette preserved what people believed it was. In doing so, it ensured the myth could continue, stronger, more capable, and resilient enough to survive the modern era intact. Legacy rarely announces itself in real time. Today, the Corvette stands not just as a survivor, but as proof that dominance is never permanent and never singular. It isn't defined solely by where ideas originate, but by which ones are allowed to take root. The car that once relied on volume and force learned that precision could amplify strength rather than dilute it. Japanese engineers did not take anything away from the Corvette. They added something harder to see, a way of thinking that treated performance as a system, not a spectacle. A belief that durability, balance, and communication mattered as much as speed. Those ideas didn't replace American identity, they refined it. This is how influence truly works. It doesn't demand credit. It doesn't arrive with flags or fanfare. It survives inside processes, habits, and expectations long after the source is forgotten. The Corvette absorbed those lessons and made them its own. until the line between inspiration and identity disappeared entirely. That is why the Corvette's modern success feels inevitable in hindsight. The car didn't win by resisting change. It won by listening carefully, selecting wisely, and evolving without apology. Innovation is rarely a zero-sum competition. It is a conversation that spans borders and decades. And the Corvette story proves the strongest legacy is built by learning, adapting, and moving forward quietly, without losing identity along the way today.